Good afternoon, everyone. We have some colleagues that are still coming in the webinar, so we will start slowly with some introductions. It's good to see you all in the new year. Glad to be welcoming in 2021. It's been a challenging 2020 and lots of hope in the air and opportunity to think about the future of education. I'm just so really excited for this, our fifth in our series on 21st century learning and fireside chat with our provost. I'm going to keep my words brief in introduction so I can spend the time introducing our guests. I do want to open up by thanking you all again for all you've done to keep our students and community learning and experiencing the best of Grand Valley through difficult personal times and difficult times to be working at an institution. So thank you so much for all you've done. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my co-host, the provost, for a few words, and then I will introduce our guest.
Thank you, Dr. Mantella. I'd like to echo what President Mantella said in my thanks for everything that everybody's doing, and having you here today is a testament to the amount of energy that everyone puts into making sure that our students receive the best education possible. This past year has shown us what works extremely well with online learning and what needs some tweaks, shall we say. And so we're very excited today to have Dr. Sarma with us as we think here at Grand Valley about what are those things that we want to carry forward that have changed the way that we think about education. So I don't want to take up too much time because we're really looking forward to the conversation. So President Mantella, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you. So I usually don't struggle with introductions, but Dr. Sarma, your accomplishments are so incredible and your roles have been so diverse in your writing that I do want to take a few moments to really let people know what you've done, who you are, and what you've accomplished really for all learners across the globe. Dr. Sarma is head of the open learning at MIT. He has a really exciting and challenging remit, and I'm going to quote where it says, the open learning, it will fling its doors open for MIT to benefit the world. He's also the Fred and Daniel Flowers Professor of Mechanical Engineering. He's worked in the fields of energy, transportation, computational geometry, computer-assisted design, and is a pioneer in RFID computation. He is also an undergraduate degree from IT Kanpur, as well as an advanced degree from Carnegie Mellon and UC Berkeley. Professor Sarma's leadership in digital and open learning has led to the creation of MicroMasters program credentials, developed the MIT Integrated Learning Initiative founded by the Jamel World Education Lab, and created a group that seeks to work together to transform teaching and learning throughout the world through research, curriculum development, community building, and innovative learning offerings. He's authored more than 200 papers, and he has what I would consider two seminal works. I'm anxious to read his third book that came out on focusing on learning and education just today. The first, The Inversion Factor, which focuses on how to thrive in an IoT economy. The second, probably the subject of so much of our conversation today, Grasp, the Science of How We Learn, which I really enjoyed. It illuminated how people learn, the most effective ways of educating, the science behind the learning, and the opportunities to think of this pandemic moment as a moment to evaluate, as the provost said, what works well in face-to-face and online in digital learning. His new book, released today, The Workforce Education, A New Roadmap, is focused on how we build America's working class by transforming workforce education and training, which is also very near and dear to the mission of Grand Valley State University. Please give a warm virtual welcome to my colleague and friend, and thank you so much for doing this, Sanjay Sarma.
Thank you so much, President Matera, Madam Provost. It's such a pleasure. What a warm introduction. Thank you. I really wish I could have been there in person, but times are such that we have to be remote. It is such a pleasure to talk to you about education, the future of education, at a time when technology, even before COVID, was doubling, tripling, quadrupling in its speed of acceptance by society every few years. So if this is a chart that shows different technologies and how long they took to be adopted, look at the telephone. And then if you look at the fridge, it's a little bit faster. If you look at the smartphone, you see how fast it is, right? Boom, everyone has a smartphone. Can you imagine? We're only 12 years since the iPhone was introduced. And here we are, humanity hanging by a thread in the, what I call the beginning of the 21st century, which is this year, not 2001, because we have spent a year training to be in this new existence with technology as a lifeline. Even before COVID, the economy was changing very rapidly. We were going towards an economy based on the gig worker, self-employed, selfies. This is from The Economist. They call it the rise of the selfie. Now, in this new world, if you sort of think about who you are, your degree matters for the first year, for your first job. But by the time you get to your third job, what matters is not your degree. It doesn't matter if you're from MIT or Grand Valley State University or some other school. What matters is how well did you do in your last gig? And you're going to become the CEO and the chief learning officer and the chief marketing officer of your life. And these are the young people we're preparing for this world today. They're going to have to effectively take charge of their lives rather than, expecting necessarily, which many will do, work for a large company. A lot more will be their own, there'll be a lot of agency, and they're going to have to be their own agents. And then COVID struck, 2019. Many industries have benefited, but most industries have suffered. And I won't go through them all, but take one, for example, retail, right? Foot traffic is down. Retailers are still being rent. It's been devastating. It's devastating and sad to see mom and pop stores struggle to make ends meet when customers can't come there. Meanwhile, retail is going towards online commerce. What does that mean? That means a massive shift in employment. And we have a number of people, millions, 35 million people who will go through this shift. And they will have to learn new skills. And the solution to all that is, as I'll say today, education. And if you think about it, and President Matera mentioned the book that came out today, Workforce Education. We all know what school looks like. We all know what college looks like. But we actually don't have a very good idea of what post-college education looks like, because in this country, we have not formalized it. This job shift means that our approach to education, which I think this cartoon sort of captures well, our approach to education has been one of standardizing people, right? Because they could then become cogs, just to be a little bit sort of provocative about it, in a factory. That's really how we created our education system. There's a lot of history about it. My book talks about it, about the historical origins in factories and taking care of the kids of parents who worked in factories, and also preparing, folks who came from the country to work in factories. And it was all about interchangeable parts, and I like to say somewhat interchangeable people. And so the creative urge was in many ways potentially a distraction. Those of you who've seen Modern Times, the Charlie Chaplin movie, know this. In fact, it's a parody of that. And this can't be the future. What we need to focus on going forward is knowledge and agency, which is people who can become the CEOs of their own life. And in this world, and pardon the snazzy slide here, I want to make the point that education becomes critical. And one of the legacies of the testing of the factory approach is When you make factory parts, you test them to qualify them. And so our education system is based a lot on testing, in fact. But what we need to change it around to is one of empowerment and taking a young person and saying, how can I make you the most successful individual for your interests, as opposed to, let me figure out whether you deserve a B or a C or an A and push you out of the system. Now, let me just take a step back. Again, a colorful slide, forgive me, but I'll make the point here. The human brain is this extraordinary thing. And over the last 100 years, beginning with the work of Ramon y Cajal, who got the Nobel Prize, there's a Ramon y Cajal Street in Madrid, for those of you who've been there. But all the way to the last 20, 10, and 5 years, we're beginning to understand how amazing it is. It is just extraordinary. 86 billion neurons, organelles, which are these regions inside the brain that function, that have various functions. The red piece in front, by the way, is called the prefrontal cortex. That is actually the CEO of the brain. That's the most recent evolutionary construct. The human brain has it, primates don't. And through that, we're understanding what it means to learn. We're understanding what it means to enjoy something. We're understanding what insight means, flexibility, morality, regulation. All these things are becoming clear. We're also understanding other pieces of the brain, like the limbic system, where you get happiness, where you have emotions and reward systems. And those are things that computer games tap into. The ironic thing is we're learning all this, and yet we stick to a model of education that is almost independent of these learnings. So this is an image that I've been using for the last 10 years. When I first started doing research on this topic, I found the oldest picture I could find of a lecture. And this is from, as you can see, 1308 AD. And you can see it doesn't look very different from a lecture today. You have a man on a podium. It's still a lot of men, right? You have students listening. If you look at this this student here, he's doing what some students do, which is, I've had enough, I'm taking a nap. And you can see that these two are talking to each other. And I have a feeling that this gentleman, if he had an iPhone, would be looking at it right now. That is our model of education. It's based on the lecture, and it's a very resilient model. And there's a fundamental assumption in the lecture model that I will argue is false. The fundamental assumption is this: the mind of the student, the learner, is a sheet of paper, and the professor holds the pen. And all the professor has to do is write on that sheet of paper, mission accomplished, education complete, let's grade the student. And this is the fundamental tenet that I will argue is wrong. In fact, the way to think about learning is different. And every parent knows this, and every child knows this. In fact, our instinct for learning is unique, and it comes from our human condition, in the sense that we are learning animals. Where humans spend more time in a state of immaturity than any other animal, but that also makes us adaptable. So we're designed to learn, we're designed to teach. It's called being a child and being a parent. And adults learn the same way. It's the same instinct, exercised at a later age. The right model is not that somehow the student's brain is a sheet of paper that the professor writes on. The right model is more the student is constructing a model of the world, and the teacher can provide to that model, as if it were a plant growing, what the plant needs when the plant needs it, not when it's convenient to the professor or to the teacher. So imagine if you said to a plant, I'm going to give you enough water for the rest of your life on day one. Wouldn't work. The plant needs sunlight, needs potassium, needs nitrogen, needs water when it needs it. And every parent knows this. And in fact, if you look at the science of learning, and I won't belabor it here just because there isn't enough time, and I certainly couldn't do it justice, but I do have a book on it that President Mandela kindly mentioned. There are fundamental principles from cognitive science which all fly in the face of what we do in the lecture. For example, did you know that when you're absorbing information, you can go about 10 minutes, and then you have cognitive overload? and the remaining 50 minutes of a 1-hour lecture, it's actually hard to focus, not because your attention span is short, but because the brain has to actually digest the information. And that takes effort by the brain. Did you know that when you learn a topic, you're better off interleaving it with another topic? Here's another one. Did you know that forgetting is actually an important step in remembering? Because when you start forgetting something, if you're reminded, the brain says, this is important. I need to elevate this. And yet forgetting is considered a sin. We wag a finger and say, I can't believe you forgot. You weren't paying attention. Our whole system of taking what is actually a very intimate action of humans, learning, parenting, being a child, we try to make it mass, and in the process we forgot our humanity to some extent. So all the science, which includes functional MRI and EEGs and diffusion tensor imaging, is showing us, interestingly, how human we are. I expected cold clinical results, but what we're seeing is amazing stuff, which reminds us that actually our humanity is what should drive us. So what I have here is a table. I'm going to walk you through it. On the left are a bunch of cognitive tricks, okay? And I'll just go through them. Lectures, it's not a cognitive trick. My daughter, who's 18, says, Daddy, don't lecture me. And I say, honey, that's what I do. That's my job. But you see, even the word lecture has a negative connotation. Retrieval effect. When you learn something, being forced to remember it actually immediately improves learning. So actually, it's good to test, not for grades. It's called a testing effect, but to improve learning. Low stakes testing is very good. High stakes testing has its value, but we lean entirely on that. Spaced repetition, what it turns out is you will forget, it has to be repeated, and you're better off relearning something just as you're getting rusty and about to forget. Interleaving. So there's a whole bunch of cognitive tricks. But then it turns out there are other things too, like curiosity, context. Context really improves learning. The science tells us this. Curiosity is like hunger for the brain. When we get hungry, we get saliva. When the brain gets hungry, it releases a neurotransmitter called dopamine. And that's when you learn. So if you could focus the classroom on these two things, students would eat it up. Okay. Coaching. This is a beautiful book by a cognitive scientist who recently passed away, Anders Ericsson. The title of the book is Peak, the Science of Expertise. And it's all about coaching and deliberate practice and hands-on learning. So fundamental. When you learn something, when you do it, and your hands are engaged, it changes your learning. So today, what we do is we do lectures in the classroom. Why? Because we're focused on exams. And if you want to just pass an exam, that's the way to do it. But in the future, if you want to create students who are enabled, that's not enough. And today, all the other tricks, we do it we sort of don't do it actually. And if at all, we do it in a, sort of half-hearted way. By the way, if you use Duolingo or Babbel to learn a new language, those guys know all these tricks. As a professor, I didn't know these tricks until I wrote my book. Right? Now, what's happening today, by the way, at Zoom lectures, that is actually the worst of both worlds. That's not online education. What we're doing in Zoom lectures is we're doing what we did in-person lectures, except we have neither the value of true online, nor do we have the intimacy of at least being in person. So this is actually the most exhausting, enervating thing we could possibly do. But of course, we don't have a choice. Teachers have been heroic to pull through. But if we had to do it all over again, we would do it this way. Translation, universal genetic code, This man is Eric Lander. He's now, by the way, President Biden's, the head of the Office of Science, Technology, and Policy. He's an MIT professor. He's one of the people who he led one team that sequenced the human genome. These are asynchronous videos with transcript. You can pause them, you can replay them. You want to do online, that's how you do it. This is jury-rigged in an emergency by heroic teachers. This is preparation, this is true online. And this, by the way, is what you get in edX, which I sit on the board of, or other well-done online courses. By the way, if you go to YouTube, there are hundreds of resources for this. 3 Blue, 1 Brown, Khan Academy, etc., etc. The future, my second last slide, is this. What we should do is push the lecture online because it works really well. You can pause people online. That's what I just showed you with Eric Lander. What we should do online also is all these tricks, which we don't do them online. What should the classroom be about? All the human stuff that online can never compete with. Coaching, in-person, curiosity, context, hands-on learning. And this is sort of a multidimensional version of what people refer to as the flipped classroom. I'm just giving it in much more detail here, because what we're doing here is saying, here are the cognitive reasons for the flipped classroom. And to me, when COVID grants us the privilege of being together again, let's make it count. Because if we go back to our old habits, it would be such a waste of time. I'll just end with 2 slides. I'll just say that MIT over the last 20 years, we've done a lot of work in open learning. OpenCourseWare has received 500 billion visits. We give our curriculum away to the free, ocw.mit.edu. MITx, we launched it at MIT. We reached 4 million people. We launched edX with Harvard. That's reached more than 100 million learners worldwide. I'm sorry, 100 million enrollments, I beg your pardon, with 130 partner universities. MIT and Harvard are the investors and owners. We launched the MicroMasters, as Professor Mantilla said. That's at MIT. We've already got about almost 1 million enrollments now in the MicroMasters. And edX has scaled the MicroMasters to the world, and we have more than 50 MicroMasters from more than 25 universities on 4 continents. And why do we do all this? Because we want to flip our own classrooms. And once we have the online stuff, we share it with the world. So that's really what I wanted to say, and just end with this. In the 21st century, which, as I just said, just began, universities have to become a center for action, creation, and impact. And the social contract has to change. So with that, President Mantilla and Provost, back to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. And I know we gave you a challenge to go through so much content and leave the kind of room you did for our colleagues to ask questions. So thank you for doing that. Maria, I'm going to turn to you to start the questions.
Great. Thank you so much for that stimulating discussion and really a great starting point for us to have some interaction with you. Here at Grand Valley, we also engage in that active learning environment and learning-centered environment. You have mentioned in some of your writings that this is the best of those small liberal arts private institutions that unfortunately may see some changes because of the pandemic with regard to finances. We engage in some of those same pedagogies as I was just mentioning, but at a much larger scale as we serve about 24,000 students. Currently, most of those students are undergraduate, and we really are looking to enlarge our footprint here at Grand Valley so that we serve more adult learners who have some barriers with regard to coming in from 8 o'clock till 5 o'clock. And so often they're working, they have families, and they need an online technology. And you had just gone through in some of your slides talking about what's good about the online, what has to be in person. And so as we think about that adult learner, what advice can you give us in terms of not just flipping the classroom, but other ways that we can engage that adult learning population?
That's a great question. And let me just say that the problem with, a lot of private small liberal arts colleges are going to struggle during COVID. They already are. Some of them won't make it. It's very heartbreaking because students will be left orphaned, and not to mention the faculty, etc. They did get pedagogy right, to their credit, right? What you've done though, and I did do the research and I read a lot about Grand Valley State University when I heard that President Mantilla had joined there, etc., is you figuring out how to do it at scale. And to me, that's very inspiring. That was the problem that they hadn't figured out, and you're figuring out how to do that. So that's really great. For adult learners, my answer to that question is, first of all, I think the content for adult learners has to be designed differently. They have a lot of frameworks, obviously, and you need to get experts to give you sort of the mental model. So the content for adults has to be sensitive to the fact that adults have certain pre-existing frameworks you can take advantage of. Then the flip side, let's say that an adult is learning, I don't know, 3-dimensional radiology. Well, you can only learn so much of that online. But then you may want to play with a radiology machine. And for that, at MIT, we launched something called boot camps, which is in-person sort of distilled experiences where you work as teams and you take on projects or you work on simulations, etc. So that becomes the flipped classroom, except it's a week on and weekend in person, right? So I think there are a number of new modalities for doing this, which will evolve over the next few years, and there's going to be a lot of pressure on society to do it. And I'm really glad to hear that you're taking these first steps in that direction.
Thank you very much. President Mantella?
I'd like to follow on with the kind of lifelong learning question, and you pointed to it, Professor Sarma, very early in your comments. At Grand Valley, we've initiated a notion of kind of a membership for life, and what should that formal relationship look like? Acknowledging that people are learning animals, as you said, need to continuously learn. Can you give us some of your thoughts and some of your global context? What are some of the models out there if we want to be on the forefront of that formalized relationship?
That's great. Well, thank you. First of all, I think it's very visionary for you to have launched the university as a membership, right? I call it Forever You, right? It's not just, just imagine if we told young people, you just need to exercise for the first 4 years of your life, you'll be fit for the rest of your life. No going to the gym again. That's basically what we're telling them about education, right? The analogy that I use is we're all standing on a treadmill. The treadmill is going backwards slowly. And if we aren't jogging, we're going to fall off the other edge. Now, the key thing here has to come down to business model, right? I actually think that there's going to be a new business model. That's one. That's actually mutually beneficial. I think companies and corporations can play a part in that. So that's sort of one fundamental thing. The second thing is engaging with experts. As I said earlier, you've got to engage with experts so that there is an opportunity for the professional, the expert, and institution to sort of work together. The third thing is the hands-on, which I mentioned, boot camps. Collectively, I refer to them as Agile Continuous Education, ACE. And the way I think about it, agility is sort of a principal engineering and innovation today. And I think education has to move in that direction. An environment where you are essentially going to the learning gym once or twice a week to stay abreast. And I think we will invent new credentials to do that as well. They don't have that. By the way, and you asked about prior, this is not new. If you think about it, doctors have to do it, right? Pilots have to do it. They have to get certified. So it's not new in some ways. It's actually well known. We just have to expand it. Because, if you do marketing and you did marketing one way, print, well, it's changed completely. You did radio, TV. Now it's, how do you market on, using Facebook or Instagram? And it's going to change again. So at some level, it may seem daunting, but frankly, I love going to the gym, and I hope we will all love going to the educational gym every week. Thank
you. I want to remind our colleagues that are listening that they can put questions in Q&A, and we already have some. So the first question seems to be for the provost and I, which is, are we going to implement some of these practices for our students? And I think that it is a continuous process, I would offer. And I know our faculty and our provosts and our deans have been thinking a great deal. What does this moment, the start of the 21st century, mean for Grand Valley State? And we need to be learners. We need to lead through our learning and say, what have we learned and what can we adopt? So I think it's absolutely a continuous process for us. And this conversation is but one way. We're trying to be sure we're all grabbing the learning moment. Let me ask the provost if she would like to add anything.
Sure, I would concur with that. One of the things that, as I mentioned earlier, we do very well here at Grand Valley is active learning, whether it be experiential learning, applying theory to practice, et cetera. What the pandemic showed us, because everyone had to teach online for the most part, it reminds us what it's like to be a learner ourselves. If we had not been familiar with those kind of pedagogies, online pedagogy. So it gives us a new sense of empathy, for one thing. Secondly, we have an excellent, the Pew Faculty Teaching and Learning Center and our partners in IT to help us with these newer pedagogies and to get the best out of them. So that we are doing, one of the things you had mentioned, Dr. Sarma, was those low stake tests. We have been implementing that throughout our curricula to help our students stay engaged. We have a great student body here at Grand Valley, people who have a lot of curiosity, and we want to continue to engender that along with our foundation of liberal education and critical thinking. So we absolutely have so much to draw on, and the lessons we've learned this past year will help us.
So I'm going to turn Amber's question, Dr. Sarma, to one for you, which is, you have two administrators on the Zoom here, the webinar, and if you were guiding us on how to be of support to faculty at this moment, as they're considering all of these matters in the context of their courses and their delivery, what advice would you have for the provost and I?
First of all, I think you should keep doing what you're doing, which is to lead from the front. And as I said, what you're doing, frankly, is at scale what smaller, frankly, richer schools have done in small sort of cloistered environments. One. Now, I think that COVID, it's shaken us all up in so many dimensions, so many ways, but I think faculty are going to come back with ideas, right? And for example, some faculty will say, listen, I could have just done my Zoom lecture once like Eric Lander and done it really well in a studio. Can we try that, right? And what I would suggest is being very open. It doesn't have to be that expensive to these experiments because we have to tiptoe our way into the future. And a couple of times we will run into walls and we have to forgive ourselves and in fact celebrate the fact that we had the courage to grope in the dark. And so if we can, and I know because I've spoken to both of you that you would do it, if we can encourage experiments from our learnings from this period and tiptoe and eventually turn into a surge, a migration into this future, I think that'll be extraordinary.
I love that. Thank you. Let me go to the second question here, which is, to the extent that the accrediting bodies reinforce today's teaching modalities, causing higher education to kind of stay where they are and perhaps be ineffective in some of our delivery?
Well, it's interesting. The great thing about innovation is you can regulators are obviously important because they maintain quality, et cetera, et cetera. But the great thing about innovation is you get to operate outside the box. Adult learning is not regulated. There is the continuing education unit, CEUs. So one of the things I say is start there because don't start only there, do things within the regulations as well. But a lot of innovation by definition goes outside the bounds of regulation. Frankly, that's what I've done throughout my engineering career, not as an administrator, is play in places where the FCC doesn't regulate or someone else doesn't regulate. And then eventually the regulation catches up. You want to be in that position rather than have to change regulation. And I think adult learning takes one there.
Right. There's a question on how long an adult can be on Zoom for training and for the training to be effective. You commented on a little bit of that in your lecture.
Yeah, Zoom is exhausting. I'm very blessed to have, two very colleagues and peers here who I enjoy talking to. But when you stare at 50 faces, the mind's trying to read 50 different body languages and then you stare at it. It's exhausting. And that's why asynchronous video is a solution. And that's what I keep saying to people. Zoom is not online education. Zoom University is what we call remote education, remote learning. And it's remote in every sense of the word. True online education is one excellent professor who has constructed an excellent series of questions and motivations and provocations in 10-minute chunks that you can pause and rewind. And please go to YouTube and watch 3 Blue, 1 Brown. Watch Minute Physics. Watch Vyhart, V-Y-H-A-R-T. Whimsical, funny, beautifully crafted elucidations of topics. And you'll see that is not Zoom.
Thank you. Next question is, how do we stimulate and nurture a student's curiosity? Sharuk is our head of our Entrepreneurship Institute, who's asking that question.
I think, Sharuk, it's a good question. And I don't mean this in a sort of a silly way, I really mean this seriously. The first thing we need to do is stop killing the curiosity. I mean, think about the expressions in our language. Curiosity killed the cat. All good things come to those who wait, right? We're in a very special time. You have 3D printing. I'm just talking about my field. You have the Raspberry Pis, you have Arduinos. And I say to students, no, all things don't come to those who wait. Just go do it right now because there are options, right? And curiosity can be as little as framing a question, going to a museum, which hopefully we can all do, and saying, why did the Impressionists do this? Why did they take this approach and break away from their predecessors? It's based actually on a slight misinterpretation of optics, but it doesn't matter, it worked, right? But that's right there, is an insight. So I think that curiosity comes from, curiosity can also be, it's sort of infectious, and it has to be a culture, and one has to sort of create it, one has to fan the flames, and one has to tolerate it, and one has to thrive in it. But I think it's there, just have to wake it up. And I don't mean this in some, sort of hippie idealistic way. I say this because as a parent, it, right? And then we spend 10 years. That's why I had the cartoon of cutting the, the speech bubbles coming out of the child's head, right? So you just have to wake it up again.
Right. Can you talk a little bit about hands-on learning and its place in our thinking?
It's very profound, actually. It's a whole field of research. It's called embodied cognition. And since I'm a mechanical engineer and not a neuroscientist, without cringing, I can give you a bad explanation, which might be easier to understand. So it turns out that when you learn something abstractly, the Descartesian view from, Descartes, right? The French philosopher, is that the mind and the body are separate. What we're finding out is, in fact, the brain, the brainstem, the spine, they're all connected in healthy human beings. And those who have that privilege, we know that when you do something with your hand, a different part of the brain engages, basically the motor cortex. And so when you learn something abstractly and do it with your hands, your learning fundamentally improves. There's actually work by the now president of Barnard College, Sean Bielak. When she was at the University of Chicago, she did some excellent work on this, on embodied cognition. So we know from a cognitive science perspective, when you learn something, if you do it with your hands, it's better. But hands-on can also be generalized. Socrates talked about philosophy and walking, talking philosophers, right? The idea is you learn philosophy and then you apply it. You go for a walk and you sort of apply it to abstract situations or something you see on the street. So the whole business of applying what you learn is a generalization of hands-on learning. By the way, the founding motto of MIT is mens et manus, mind and hand. So it runs deep in our soul. Thank heavens the science backs us up. Otherwise, we'd be very embarrassed right now.
Thank you. Austin is asking us, asking you if you can talk about age as it relates to learning. So do we think about learning the same for a first grader as a freshman in college?
Yes and no. So the learning is the same in the sense that the brain is the same, actually, right? And our learning instincts are the same, but one thing changes, and it has to do with the schema and the frameworks. So to a first grader, when, my nephew plays with as it happened recently with my wine glass and breaks it, right? He's trying to figure out things like, he's doing an experiment. There's a beautiful book about it by Alison Gopnik called The Scientist in the Crib. He's being a scientist. He's figuring out if the glass will break, is it brittle, and how far can I push this before uncle gets crazy, right? So those are the three sort of hypotheses he's testing out. A freshman has, 17 years of history of frameworks. So you have to understand that they have a lot of frameworks, but the learning is still the same. The learning pattern, they're just building on frameworks. They know the glass breaks. They know their boundaries, hopefully, right? But they're learning, but they have to build new frameworks. Adults have a lot of frameworks, right? In fact, sometimes it's too many. So you have to undo the frameworks. You have to almost unlearn. And so you're thinking about it all wrong, please throw that framework away. You have to look at it this way. In fact, that's the challenge often, right? So what changes with age is how many frameworks you have. And when we learn something, we pull out a framework from our brain, we match what we're learning to that framework, we compress it and we suck it back in. So the frameworks can be a help, except if you have the wrong frameworks, and so there's an element of unlearning. So that's a sort of a hand-wavy explanation, but the actual active learning, the way the brain reacts, generally the same.
Great. Do you think, one of the questions that have come in asks if you think that we need to help students along in the process? So it's really about what they're used to as the dominant model. And so will they have a natural resonance to new models, or do we have to help them move from one model to the next?
We absolutely have to take the students in with us. We can't just announce to them we're changing the models. The fact of the matter is the students have been told, tests matter. You must sit in a classroom and try and act like you're paying attention even if you're not, or even if you're not learning, right? And they're told these are the values, that they're going to be held to. So you've got to bring them along, and we've got to tell them why we're doing this, why it's different, how tragic it is it, in college, that a student might spend several years in college, but they never learn how to learn. Can you imagine? I mean, it's sort of shocking to me. They're there to learn, but we never teach them how to learn, right? And if you really want to teach them how to learn, you teach them the cognitive science and principles. And if you did that, you would be doing what you just said. So we have learned over the years, 20 years at MIT, that you have to bring the students on board. And they'll be wonderful partners, but you can't just announce it to them.
Right. I'm going to pause for the provost to see if you have any questions, because she gave me the tough job. It's I'm a distracted learner right now because I'm watching these great questions and trying to pose them. Maria, is there anything you wanted to ask before I jump back to the list?
Yes, I do. One of the things I've been thinking about, as I mentioned, we're engage our students actively, but as I like to say, we're a community of teacher scholars, and we really encourage the faculty here to engage in the scholarship of teaching. And so I'm wondering, obviously MIT is a different type, you're an R1 institution than we are, but as we're trying to change the face of higher education and education in general here in the United States and across the globe, what do you see the value of the scholarship of teaching in propagating these ideas and our activities that we know work? Can you speak to that kind of scholarship for us?
I think, when I joined MIT 25 years ago, I was told, don't be too good a teacher. It'll mean you aren't doing good research. Okay, so that's sort of one dichotomy, right? The other thing is somehow learning has been treated a little bit as teaching has been treated a little bit as a kitchen science. And it's confused with entertainment a little bit. Someone said, oh, Sanjay, you're a good teacher because you tell good jokes. Well, actually, my jokes are pretty bad, right? The point is that we need to elevate this craft. We need to take pride in our craft, and we need to really apply rigor and publish it. I started publishing and learning. I mean, most of my publications are still very hardcore engineering, about 10 years ago. And I did it just to get into the flow of things. And we have a good researcher, Katrina Baghiati, I work with, and she and I started publishing, and I sort of again tiptoed into it. But I do think that we need to venerate this most important skill, because in my view, it is the learning and teaching are sort of the highest pursuits of humankind, actually. So the most intellectual thing we could do, that every child, when they learn a language, the feat exceeds that of Einstein, right? We don't know how it occurs. So it could be everything from the cognitive neuroscience level all the way to classroom practices. And I think the scholarship is essential in this field.
Absolutely. I'm wondering too, as we think about that, there's so many assumptions about education in our country. How do we change that? That model of the researcher as being much more important, as you said, don't be too good of a teacher because your research will suffer. How do we change that narrative here in the United States? into the most important thing, and you're preaching to the choir with me, especially, but here at Grand Valley.
You know, I had the pleasure this weekend of listening to, so the Nobel Prize in Math is called the Fields Medal. And I had the pleasure of listening to a Fields medalist, Manjul Bhargava, who's a professor at Princeton. And he gave a lecture on music and math. And he mixed history, art, science, and delivered a gem of pedagogy, right? I do believe that the intellectual challenges of presenting something in a way that can be easily absorbed, can be durably absorbed, but also practically employed in some way, is something that we will realize is actually more scholarly than some of the other stuff. Take Feynman, Richard Feynman, right? MIT Caltech man, right? I mean, his books on, or Carl Sagan at Cornell, right? I mean, their teaching was pure scholarship. And I think those boundaries will blur as we figure out how teaching something actually is the most profoundly clarifying aspect of scholarship. So that's my view anyway. Maybe it's romantic, we'll see.
Thank you.
So we have two questions. One I see as a larger conceptual question, and one is sort of using the work you've done with edX and MicroMasters perhaps as an example. So one is, you know, with this level of transformation of education, do we need alliances? Do we need to work together across sector educational institutions? And then the second is, so how would we think about the work you've done with MicroMasters and the opportunity that may present to graduate programs or portfolios? So macro, and then sort of bring it down a little bit for us.
I think we absolutely have to seek alliances. I actually made 7 years ago, I taught a course and I had the students watch a bunch of YouTube videos of various things where I thought that the person teaching, you know, this was engineering, it was transportation. I pointed them at some lectures on jet engines. And I thought the person who gave the lecture did as good or better job than I could have. And without knowing that person, I built an alliance with that person, right? So, and now imagine if I could reach out to them and get to know them and say, hey, you know, do you have something on this? And maybe in your next lecture, can you put this in? Because I think this division of labor will address the scalability issue we're locked into right now. Because our problem right now is if you teach 5 classes, you're spending, I don't know, 15, 20, 25 hours giving the same lecture. I remember in 2010, I was giving a lecture in manufacturing thinking I've given this same lecture 15 times, you know? I wish I could record it. And of course, at that time, I thought, oh my God, that would be terrible. But now I'm thinking, that would have been great, right? Except maybe someone else should have recorded. So I think alliances are in our future. The MicroMasters is an example of what I call stackable credentials. By the way, it's outside regulation. Although I have to say that NIASC, which is a Northeastern regulatory agency, was very supportive of it. And the way the MicroMasters works is you get your MicroMasters. There are no admissions to the MicroMasters. You just take it. It's a name I made up one day in the shower. I just like, what do you call it? Oh, MicroMasters, okay. And the idea is that students take the MicroMasters, no admissions. It's difficult to finish, but if you finish, you get this thing called the MicroMasters, right? So we got rid of admissions, turn it upside down. I call it inverted admissions. Now, once you finish, you can apply to MIT with it in hand. Now we can now see how well you did. And if you get admitted, you finish in half the time, right? The stackable credentials. We have a bunch of students who have never set foot on campus. They take MicroMasters after MicroMasters and they're building it up and putting on their resumes, right? We even have a blockchain-based credential system so they can put on their resume with a link that proves they actually did it. So it's not just a claim. So my view is these stackable credentials may well be the future. And there's no regulation. So again, the regulation question.
Great. There's a question here that's focused on the equities and inequities of moving from one model, let's say the more predominant lecture model, to the flip model, what are the kinds of considerations around equity as we think about technology, flipped classrooms, some of the direction we need to go in?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm glad you asked, because I would have glossed over it, and it deserves deeper examination. Done poorly, it can exacerbate the equity issues in this country and every country, done poorly. In fact, I will make the argument that for all the stuff we've done with MITx, which I take a lot of pride in, we may have actually exacerbated equity issues, because the kids who take the online content are the kids of people like me. So there are many reasons why it doesn't work, why it can exacerbate. One is internet access. You've seen pictures of kids taking, doing their online courses, sitting outside fast food restaurants, because that's the only place they would get internet access. So I think the internet becomes a existential thing. I think it's almost become a human right now. The second is support. Our daughter has 2 PhD parents to support her, right? If a kid with 2 working parents who are not terribly educated is taking a course in physics and needs support, where does she get it? And I do think we need to establish online support mechanisms. So this is something that we need to take on at a grand scale. And done poorly, it may simply exacerbate the differences.
Thank you. There's a question here on business model that I'd like to turn to, and that is how we balance the notion of sort of free and open access, which you have mastered, and with the need to have a business model and a university to be financially solvent.
There's also a question I noticed on the subscription model. I do think that they go hand in hand. My view is that the way MIT makes up, we have 1 million people taking a MicroMasters, right? They have to pay each a lot less for this to be worth a while. So my content is freemium. In other words, you want the content, it's free. You want a credential, you have to pay, because we have to check your passport, you have to, or whatever, some ID, we have to proctor it. And, we charge money for all that. So we have gone to the sort of the high end, not Grand Valley, but in general, tuition is high, small. I think we need to go to high quality product, large numbers, lower tuition, more accessibility. I think there's a middle ground where you can have your cake and eat it too. And the pioneer in this is Paul LeBlanc of Southern New Hampshire University, SNHU. And if you haven't checked out what they've done, you should, because I think there are, another person is Michael Crow at ASU. They have figured this out, and I give them a lot of credit for it. So I do think there's a there. I just feel like we're in a sort of a local optimum. We need to shift out and go to another optimum.
Yeah, no, I think most of those institutions and providers have done that through scale. It's with that kind of freemium and scale, or a different pricing, as you pointed to. So it's also a challenge that is new to education. When we think about the models we teach in, we think about intimacy. You use the word, and the importance of maintaining it. So as you think about scale, could you help us think about some of the principles we should be considering to scale with the kind of learning impact that you're talking about?
I think, I grew up in a poor country. I grew up in India. I got my education there, got my bachelor's there. And I think that there is no doubt that for me in India, I wasn't poor, but we weren't super rich either. Any water in the glass was a glass half full. For people who don't have access, it's incredible. For people who can get the intimate in person, of course it's better. Right? So if you're a working parent and you're working 2 jobs and you have a kid, doing stuff online and learning something, getting up to the point where maybe you can take a week off and do a boot camp, that's really good. That won't earn, that particular individual can get a good deal, and the university won't earn a lot of money from them, but from serving a lot of them, the university can earn enough money that for the students between ages 17 to 21 who actually need much more intimate hand-holding, coaching, etc., you can actually subsidize it. So I actually see it as a portfolio. And the portfolio is such that you're serving different people, meeting them where they need to be met, But net, the university can fulfill its mission with the right combination or the right fraction of intimacy and where it's needed, but good content where that's all that matters.
You've implied this, and even on that comment, which is that, and I've heard your lectures before, and I won't call them lectures, your discussions before. And you've always focused on the changes this is making to face-to-face learning. When you talk about flipped, you can see it. Drill into that just a little bit more for us about, we're coming back and we have this sort of precious resource that we took for granted, face-to-face learning. And we've got to be thinking much more about the use of that within the context of a broader learning model. Say a little more about your thoughts there, please, before we have to close.
Just imagine we're in late 2021, we're all vaccinated, we're all back. COVID is a distant memory. And we recreate the classroom and it looks exactly like a Zoom classroom, except that the students in the back can't even see the professor. Right? Just imagine that. How tragic would that be? If anything, at least in the Zoom classroom, everyone's equidistant from the professor, right? Visually. What I think will end up happening is students will go, hey, could we just watch a recording and do a project? Can we change? Why are the chairs arranged in a grid? Why can't we make them a circle? You know, and I think what will end up happening is, if I were teaching painting, if I were teaching impressionist painting, I would say to students, try it, paint it. I'm not going to analyze Surah for you or, you know, examine pointillism for you. Do some pointillism. I know you won't be Surah, but let's try it, right? I've forgotten, is Surah a pointillist? I think so. We'll see. Anyway, you get the idea. Pissarro, maybe, right? So the point is that I think we will go hands-on naturally. So that means they need paints. So, and they're going to mess up the floor. That means the shape of the classroom will change. The custodian's job will change. They need larger tables, right? So you see, the moment you head down that path, it's a sort of a fundamentally, it starts small, but before you know it, it's quite different in a different place. I hope that's what will happen.
Thank you so much. Provost, do you want to add some closing comments?
Just thank you so much. We really appreciate the kind of stimulating discussion, lots to think about and lots to think about as we're moving ahead here at Grand Valley.
Thank you.
I too want to add my thanks, and I want to offer to those who are listening today, we've registered and we want to make Dr. Sarma's book available to you, so you can, you'll get an email, and if you want to go deeper, if you want to learn more, we'd love to have you have the opportunity to do that. Sanjay, I learn something every time I listen to you. I'm deeply grateful you spent this time with us, and I know how many requests you get, and you said yes to us, so thank you so much.
No, it's such a pleasure. Really great to see you again. Wonderful to learn about Grand Valley, and I hope to visit you someday and figure out why you called it a valley, as I said earlier. But thank you so much.
And you have an invitation. I'll be sure you get out here.